As Director of the University of Johannesburg Centre for Africa-China Studies, Professor David Monyae joins us now to expand on some of the big talking points happening at that meeting. A very good evening to you, Professor. Thank you for your time. I know it's a very good morning on your end as you're currently in China, having been part of these engagements and conversations that are happening. We listened as the President spoke in great depth about South Africa's relationship with China, agreeing to elevate trade relations between the two countries and also touching on the issue of trade deficit between the two countries. Before we even move ahead with that, perhaps let's start off, as African leaders are converging in China, what is the objective of such a meeting?
The meeting is historically started in the year 2000, and at that time trade was only $10 billion across the entire continent. And as of last year, trade between Africa and China has reached $282 billion. It's quite a huge, significant growth, unprecedented, and it's growing into a number of sectors, as most people have already alluded to, in key sectors of the economy and the financial sector, infrastructure, agriculture in particular, where it's expanding even more. The bigger question, I think, before us is to what extent can South Africa really increase its capacity to supply a very complicated market. The Chinese market has more than 400 million middle class. And it's not just South Africa or Africa that is entering that market. We're competing with a number of countries in the developed world, in Asia, who have more advantages in terms of distance, relation with China, and capacity they have. And therefore, I think it's high time to look at the question of efficiency, beefing up our infrastructure, keeping the lights on at home. You need a lot of energy. You need to ensure that Transnet is in good shape to ensure that all these goods can move quickly and fresh into the Chinese market. And we also need to improve the quality of these products. We cannot continue selling raw material, raw bananas and avos. I think we need to go beyond that to have finished products across the board, including minerals, to ensure that we benefit and turn around the issue that the President has rightly put in terms of the trade imbalance between the two countries.
With China being the second largest economy in the world, would you think it's unrealistic to, at this stage, talk about balanced trade? I mean, you've ironed and fleshed out the demographics and looked at the probabilities, making suggestions on how improvement can be made.
I think with time, taking efforts, and ensuring that we increase the skills of our people, in how we do business, we get organized, we have the capacity and the will to increase more products into China. I think with time we will indeed balance the trade, but a lot of effort is required, and we compete with others. But we also have to look at that China is not the only market we have. We also have to increasingly enter into the US market, into Europe. And when it comes to the question of beef, do we have enough beef entering and feed such a huge market? Therefore, there's more that is needed at home. And this, we should also go hand in hand in terms of the kind of employment to deal with issues of poverty, inequality, and unemployment at home. So these are key issues that is driving the government of national unity.
How does this meeting differ from others that you've attended and observed, more so as we consider China's domestic, regional, and global politics?
Africa is operating from a low base, so to speak. that in the very same year that this forum was established in 2000, Europeans and a European magazine had stated that the African continent is a hopeless continent. And we have seen with the advantage that the continent is having and more economic activities, investments, infrastructure development across the African continent, what it is doing, it is attracting other partners. And there's a huge competition. We see Japanese, Turkish, the Gulf states, the United States, AGOA, and the EU. The competition is increasing among potential investors entering the African continent. This gives Africa an advantage in terms of having more access to the global capital markets. It also gives the African continent a chance at easing some of the issues that it confronts in dealing with poverty. However, what is required is to work on key issues, ensuring that transport across the continent is improved, trade among Africans is improved, as well as the basic energy, bulk water are handled in a way that brings more and more trade between the African continent with China and everyone else.
What have agreements in past summits achieved or perhaps unlocked when we look at access to Africa's markets for Beijing?
I think we really have seen the concern expressed by President Ramaphosa, particularly of trade imbalance in the previous summits. In certain instances, you see improvements in key areas, particularly on the question of agriculture, where Africa has a comparative advantage. We're also seeing expansion into new areas, particularly on issues of strategic minerals. As China advances technology, it relies particularly on the EVs, the solar, concerning climate change. Africa has some of the strategic raw material, and China is interested in accessing this material, but in competition with other developed countries that are entering the African market. And now that brings us back to what extent the continent can stabilize issues of conflict, the movement, and Southern Africa in particular has advantage. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, Angola are also entering into agreements with so many other players, and therefore China remains the major player in this field.
Very well. Perhaps very quickly before we let you go, what are some of your expectations from the summit?
I think one is expecting a bit of change and continuity in terms of your traditional agreements coming from the summit. We're not going to see mega projects, as was the case. Projects such as one in Kenya, the Nairobi-Mombasa rail, or your Djibouti-Ethiopia rail. I think China is starting to shy away from major projects, given the depressed global economy. And I think President Xi Jinping has put in small and beautiful projects, smaller project that requires less capital and to handle and be able to ensure that these projects are in line with climate change. And therefore, I think more of that will happen. I think we're seeing more of this in Ethiopia, particularly in Addis Ababa.
Very well. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. Enjoy your morning. Director of the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies, Professor David Monyae, joining us there to expand on the Africa-China meeting that's happening in China this week.